The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 37 The Last Shirt. Mooning Around. Sailing Orders. The Witch Pie. That was all fixed. So then we went away and went to the rummage pile in the back yard, where they keep the old boots and rags and pieces of bottles, and wore-out tin things, and all such truck, and scratched around and found an old tin wash-pan, and stopped up the holes as well as we could, to bake the pie in, and took it down cellar, and stowed it full of flour, and started for breakfast, and found a couple of shingle-nails that Tom said would be handy for a prisoner to scrabble his name and sorrows on the dungeon walls with, and dropped one of them in Aunt Sally's apron pocket, which was hanging on the chair, and t'other we struck in the band of Uncle Silas's hat, which was on the bureau, because we heard the children say their pa and ma was going to the runaway nigger's house this morning, and then we went to breakfast, and Tom dropped the pewter spoon in Uncle Silas's coat pocket, and Aunt Sally wasn't come yet, so we had to wait a little while, and when she come, she was hot and red and cross, and couldn't hardly wait for the blessing, and then she went to sluicing out coffee with one hand and cracking the handiest child's head with her thimble with the other, and says,
"I've hunted high and I've hunted low, and it does beat all. What has become of your other shirt?"
My heart fell down amongst my lungs and livers and things, and a hard piece of corn crust started down my throat after it, and got met on the road with a cough, and was shot across the table, and took one of the children in the eye, and curled him up like a fishing worm, and let a cry out of him the size of a war-whoop. And Tom he turned kinder blue around the gills, and it all amounted to a considerable state of things for about a quarter of a minute, or as much as that, and I would 'a' sold out for a half price if there was a bidder. But after that we was all right again. It was the sudden surprise of it that knocked us so kind of cold. Uncle Silas he says,
"It's most uncommon curious. I can't understand it. I know perfectly well I took it off because—"
"Because you ain't got one on. Just listen at the man. I know you took it off, and I know it by a better way than your wool-gathering memory, too, because it was on the clothes line yesterday. I see it there myself. But it's gone. That's the long and the short of it, and you'll just have to change to a red flannel one till I can get time to make a new one, and it'll be the third I made in 2 years. It just keeps a body on the jump to keep you in shirts, and whatever you do manage to do with all of 'em is more'n I can make out. A body'd think you would learn to take some sort of care of 'em at your time of life."
I know it, Sally, and I do try all I can, but it oughtn't to be altogether my fault because, I don't see 'em nor have nothing to do with 'em, except when they're on me, and I don't believe I've ever lost one of them off of me.
"Well, it ain't your fault if you haven't, Silas. You'd have done it if you could, I reckon. And the shirt ain't all that's gone, nuther. There's a spoon gone, and that ain't all. There was 10, and now there's only 9. The calf got the shirt, I reckon, but the calf never took the spoon, that's certain."
Why, what else is gone, Sally?
"There's 6 candles gone, that's what. The rats could have got the candles, and I reckon they did. I wonder they don't walk off with the whole place, the way you're always going to stop their holes and don't do it. And if they weren't fools they'd sleep in your hair, Silas. You'd never find it out, but you can't lay the spoon on the rats, and that I know."
Well, Sally, I'm in fault, and I acknowledge it. I've been remiss, but I won't let tomorrow go by without stopping up them holes.
"Oh, I wouldn't hurry. Next year'll do. Matilda Angelina Amita Phelps."
Whack comes the thimble, and the child snatches her claws out of the sugar bowl without fooling around any. Just then the nigger woman steps on to the passage and says,
"Missus, there's a sheet gone."
"A sheet gone? Well, for the land's sake!"
I'll stop up them holes today,"
says Uncle Silas, looking sorrowful.
"Oh, do shut up. Suppose the rats took the sheet. Where's it gone, Lice?"
"Cloudy goodness, I hain't no notion, Miss Sally. She was on de clothesline yisterday, but she done gone, and she ain't there no more now."
"I reckon the world is coming to an end. I never see the beat of it in all my born days. A shirt and a sheet and a spoon and 6 can—"
Missus,
comes a young yellow wench.
there's a brass candlestick missing.
Clear out from here, you hussy, or I'll take a skillet to you.
Well, she was just a billin'. I began to lay for a chance. I reckoned I would sneak out and go for the woods, till the weather moderated. She kept a ragin' right along, running her insurrection all by herself, and everybody else mighty meek and quiet. And at last Uncle Silas, looking kind of foolish, fishes up that spoon out of his pocket. She stopped, with her mouth open and her hands up, and as for me, I wished I was in Jerusalem or somewheres, but not long, because she says,
It's just as I expected. So you had it on your pocket all the time? And like as not, you've got the other things there too. How did it get in there?
I really don't know, Sally.
he says, kind of apologizing.
Well, you know I would tell. I was a-studying over my text in Acts 17 before breakfast, and I reckon I put it in there, not noticing, meaning to put my Testament in. And it must be so, because my Testament ain't in it. But I'll go and see, and if the Testament is where I had it, I'll know I didn't put it in, and that will show that I laid the Testament down and took up the spoon and...
Oh, for the land's sake, give a body a rest. Go along now, the whole kit and billing of you, and don't come nigh me again till I got back my peace of mind.
I'd a heard her if she had said it to herself, let alone speak it out, and I'd a got up and obeyed her if I'd a been dead. As we was passin' through the sitting room, the old man he took up his hat, and the shingle nail fell out on the floor, and he just merely picked it up and laid it on the mantel shelf, and never said nothin', and went out. Tom see him do it, and remembered about the spoon, and says,
Well, it ain't no use to send things by him no more. He ain't reliable.
Then he says,
But he done us a good turn with the spoon, anyway, without knowing it. And so we'll go and do him one without him knowing it. Stop up his rat holes.
there was a noble good lot of them down cellar, and it took us a whole hour, but we done the job tight, and good and shipshape. Then we heard steps on the stairs, and blowed out our light and hid, and here comes the old man, with a candle in one hand and a bundle of stuff in the other, looking as absent-minded as the year before last. He went a-mooning around, first to one rat hole and then another, till he'd been to 'em all. Then he stood about 5 minutes, picking tallow drip off his candle and thinking. Then he turns off slow and dreamy towards the stairs, saying,
Well, for the life of me, I can't remember when I done it. I could show it now that I warn't to blame on account of the rats. But never mind. Let it go. I reckon it wouldn't do no good.
and so he went a-mumbling upstairs, and then we left. He was a mighty nice old man, and always is. Tom was a good deal bothered about what to do for a spoon, but he said we got to have it, so he took a think. When he had ciphered it out, he told me how we was to do. Then we went and waited around the spoon basket till we see Aunt Sally comin', and then Tom went to counting the spoons and laying them out to one side, and I slid one of them up my sleeve, and Tom says,
Why, Aunt Sally, there ain't but 9 spoons yet.
she says,
Go along to your play, and don't bother me. I know better, I counted them myself.
Well, I've counted them twice, Auntie, and I can't make but 9.
she looked out of all patience, but of course she come to count. Everybody would.
I declare to gracious there ain't but 9.
She says,
Why, what in the world? Plague take the things, I'll count 'em again.
so I slipped back the one I had, and when she got done counting, she says,
Hang the troublesome rubbish, there's 10 now.
and she looked huffy, and bothered both. But Tom says,
Why, Auntie, I don't think there's 10.
You numbskull, didn't you see me count 'em?
I know, but...
Well, I'll count 'em again.
but I smouched one, and they come out 9, same as the other time. Well, she was in a tearing way, just a trembling all over, she was so mad. But she counted and counted, till she got that addled. She'd start to count in the basket for a spoon sometimes, and so 3 times they come out right, and 3 times they come out wrong. Then she grabbed up the basket and slammed it across the house and knocked the cat galley west. And she said, clear out, and let her have some peace, and if we come bothering around her again, betwixt that and dinner, she'd skin us. So we had the odd spoon, and dropped it in her apron pocket while she was a-giving us our sailing orders, and Jim got it all right, along with her shingle nail, before noon. We was very well satisfied with this business, and Tom allowed it was worth twice the trouble it took, because he said now she couldn't ever count them spoons twice alike again to save her life, and wouldn't believe she counted them right if she did, and said that after she'd about counted her head off for the next 3 days, he judged she'd give it up and offer to kill anybody that wanted her to ever count them any more. So we put the sheet back on the line that night, and stole one out of her closet, and kept on putting it back and stealing it again for a couple of days till she couldn't know how many sheets she had any more. And she didn't care, and weren't a-going to bully the rest of her soul out about it, and wouldn't count them again not to save her life. She'd druther die first. So we was all right now, as to the shirt and the sheet and the spoon and the candles, by the help of the calf and the rats and the mixed-up counting. And as to the candlestick, it weren't no consequence. It would blowed over by and by. But that pie was a job. We had no end of trouble with that pie. We fixed it up away down in the woods, and cooked it there, and we got it done at last, and very satisfactory too, but not all in one day, and we had to use up 3 washpans full of flour before we got through, and we got burnt pretty much all over in places, and eyes put out with the smoke, because, you see, we didn't want nothing but a crust, and we couldn't prop it right, and she would always cave in. But of course we thought of the right way at last, which was to cook the latter too, in the pie. So then we laid in with Jim the second night, and tore up the sheet all in the little strings and twisted them together, and long before daylight we had a lovely rope that you could hung a person with. We let on it took 9 months to make it, and in the forenoon we took it down to the woods, but it wouldn't go into the pie. Being made a whole sheet that way, there was rope enough for 40 pies if we'd wanted them, and plenty left over for soup or sausage or anything you choose. We could have had a whole dinner, but we didn't need it. All we needed was just enough for the pie, and so we throwed the rest away. We didn't cook none of the pies in the washpan, afraid the solder would melt, but Uncle Silas, he had a noble brass warming pan which he thought considerable of, because it belonged to one of his ancestors, with a long wooden handle that come over from England with William the Conqueror and the Mayflower, or one of them early ships, and was hid away up garret with a lot of other old pots and things that was valuable, not on account of being any account, because they weren't, but on account of them being relics, you know, and we snaked her out private, and took her down there. But she failed on the first pies, because we didn't know how, but she come up smiling on the last one. We took and lined her with dough, and set her in the coals, and loaded her up with rag rope, and put on a dough roof, and shut down the lid, and put hot embers on top, and stood off 5 foot with the long handle, cool and comfortable, and in 15 minutes she turned out a pie that was a satisfaction to look at, but the person that ate it would want to fetch a couple of kegs of toothpicks along, for if that rope ladder wouldn't cram him down to business, I don't know nothing what I'm talking about, and lay him in enough stomach ache to last him till next time too. Nat didn't look when we put the witch pie in Jim's pan, and we put the 3 tin plates in the bottom of the pan under the victuals, and so Jim, got everything all right, and as soon as he was by himself, he busted into the pot and hid the rope ladder inside of his straw tick, and scratched some marks on a tin plate, and throwed it out of the window hole. End of chapter 37. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 38. The Coat of Arms. A Skilled Superintendent. Unpleasant Glory. A Tearful Subject. Making them pins was a distressed, tough job, and so was the saw, and Jim allowed the inscription was going to be the toughest of all. That's the one which the prisoner has to scrabble on the wall, but he had to have it. Tom said he got to. There weren't no case of a state prisoner not scribbled in his inscription to leave behind, and his coat of arms.
Look at Lady Jane Grey,
he says.
Look at Guilford Dudley. Look at Northumberland. Why, Huck, suppose it is considerable trouble. What you gonna do? How you going to get around it? Jim's got to do his inscription and coat of arms. They all do.
Jim says.
Why, Marse Tom, I ain't got no coat of arms. I ain't got nothing but dis yere old shirt. And you knows I got to keep the journal on dat.
Oh, you don't understand, Jim. A coat of arms is very different.
Well, I says, Jim's right anyway, when he says he ain't got no coat of arms, because he ain't.
I reckon I know that,
Tom says.
But you bet he'll have one before he goes out of this, because he's going out right, and there ain't going to be no flaws in his record.
So whilst me and Jim filed away at the pins on the brickbat apiece, Jim a making his'n out of the brass, and I making mine out of the spoon, Tom set to work to think out the coat of arms. By and by, he said he struck so many good ones he didn't hardly know which to take, but there was one which he reckoned he'd decide on. He says,
On the scrunchion, we'll have a band or in the dexter base, a saltier Murray in the fess, with a dog, couchant, for common charge, and under his foot a chain embattled for slavery, with a chevron vert in a cheap engraved, and 3 invected lines on a field azure, with the nombril points rampant on a dancet indented, crest, a runaway nigger, Sable, with his bundle over his shoulder, on a bar sinister, and a couple of ghouls for support, which is you and me. Motto, Maggiore frette, minore otto. Got it out of a book. It means more haste, the less speed.
Gee Willikins, I said, but what does the rest of it mean?
We ain't got no time to bother over that,
he says.
We got to dig in like all get out.
Well, anyway, I says, what's some of it? What's a fess?
A fess? A fess is... You don't need to know what a fess is. I'll show him how to make it when he gets to it.
Shucks, Tom, I says. I think you might tell a person. What's a bar sinister?
Oh, I don't know, but he's got to have it. All the nobility does.
That was just his way. If it didn't suit him to explain a thing to you, he wouldn't do it. You might pump at him a week, it wouldn't make no difference. He got all that coat of arms business fixed, so now he started in to finish up the rest of that part of the work, which was to plan out a mournful inscription. Said Jim got to have one, like they all done. He made up a lot, and wrote them out on a paper, and read 'em off so.
1. Here a captive heart busted. 2. Here a poor prisoner, forsook by the world and friends, fretted his sorrowful life. 3. Here a lonely heart broke, and a worn spirit went to its rest after 37 years of solitary captivity. 4. Here, homeless and friendless, after 37 years of bitter captivity, perished a noble stranger, natural son, of Louis XIV.
Tom's voice trembled whilst he was reading them, and he most broke down. When he got done, he couldn't no way make up his mind which one for Jim to scrabble on to the wall. They was all so good, but at last he allowed he would let him scrabble them all on. Jim said it would take him a year to scrabble such a lot of truck onto the logs with a nail, and he didn't know how to make letters, besides. But Tom said he would block 'em out for him, and then he wouldn't have nothing to do but just follow the lines. Then pretty soon he says,
Come to think, the logs ain't a-gonna do. They don't have log walls in a dungeon. We got to dig the inscriptions into a rock. We'll fetch rock.
Jim said the rock was worse than the logs. He said it would take him such a pissin' long time to dig them into a rock he wouldn't ever get out. But Tom said he would let me help him do it. Then he took a look to see how me and Jim was getting along with the pens. It was most pescatarious hard work and slow, and didn't give my hands no show to get well of the sores, and we didn't seem to make no headway hardly. So Tom says,
I know how to fix it. We got to have a rock for the coat of arms and mournful inscriptions, and we can kill 2 birds with that same rock. There's a gaudy big grindstone down at the mill, and we'll smooch it and carve the things on it and file the pens and the saw on it too.
It weren't no slouch of an idea, and it weren't no slouch of a grindstone nuther, but we allowed we'd tackle it. It weren't quite midnight yet, so we cleared out for the mill, leaving Jim at work. We smooched the grindstone, and set out to roll her home, but it was a most nation tough job. Sometimes do what we couldn't keep her from falling over, and she come mighty near mashing us every time. Tom said she was going to get one of us sure, before we got through. We got her halfway, and then we was plump played out, and most drownded with sweat. We see it weren't no use. We got to go and fetch Jim. So he raised up his bed and slid the chain off the bed leg, and wrapped it around and round his neck, and we called out through our hole and down there, and Jim and me laid into that grindstone and walked her along like nothing, and Tom superintended. He could have out-superintended any boy I ever see. He knowed how to do everything. Our hole was pretty big, but it weren't big enough to get the grindstone through, but Jim, he took the pick and soon made it big enough. Then Tom marked out them things on it with a nail, and set Jim to work on 'em, with the nail for a chisel and an iron bolt for the rubbage in the lean-to for a hammer, and told him to work till the rest of his candle quit on 'em, and then he could go to bed, and hide the grindstone under his straw tick and sleep on it. Then we helped him fix his chain back on the bed leg, and was ready for bed ourselves. But Tom thought of something and says,
You got any spiders in there, Jim?
No, sir. Thanks to goodness I hain't, Mars Tom.
All right. We'll get you some.
But bless you, honey, I don't want none. I afeard on 'em. I just soon have rattlesnakes around.
Tom thought a minute or two and says,
It's a good idea, and I reckon it's been done. It must have been done. It stands to reason. Yes, it's a prime good idea. Where could you keep it?
Keep what, Mars Tom?
Why, a rattlesnake?
To goodness gracious alive, Mars Tom. Why, if there was a rattlesnake to come in here, I'd take and bust right out through that log wall, I would, with my head.
Why, Jim, you wouldn't be afraid of it after a little. You could tame it.
Tame it?
Yes, easy enough. Every animal is grateful for kindness and petting, and they wouldn't think of hurting a person that pets them. Any book will tell you that. You try, that's all I ask. You just try for 2 or 3 days. Why, you can get him so in a little while that he'll love you and sleep with you and won't stay away from you a minute, and will let you wrap him round your neck and put his head in your mouth.
Please, Mars Tom, don't talk so. I can't stand it. He let me shove his head in my mouth for a favor, ain't it? I lay he'd wait a powerful long time 'fore I asked him. And more'n that, I don't want him to sleep with me.
Jim, don't act so foolish. A prisoner's got to have some kind of a dumb pet, and if a rattlesnake ain't ever been tried, why, there's more glory to be gained in your being the first ever tried than any other way you could ever think of to save your life.
Why, Marse Tom, I don't want no such glory. Snake take and bite Jim's chin off, then whar's the glory? No, sah, I don't want no sich doin's.
Blame it. Can't you try? I only want you to try. You needn't keep it up if it don't work.
But the trouble all done if the snake bite me while I was a-tryin' him. Marse Tom, I was willin' to tackle most anything. That ain't unreasonable, but if ye and Huck fetches a rattlesnake in here for me to tame, I was goin' to leave, that's sure.
Well then, let it go if you're so bullheaded about it. We can get you some garter snakes, and you can tie some buttons on their tails, and let on they're rattlesnakes, and I reckon that'll have to do.
I can stand them, Marse Tom, but blame if I couldn't get along without 'em. I tell you dat. I never knowed before 'twas so much bother and trouble to be a prisoner.
Well, it always is when it's done right. You got any rats around here?
No, sah, I hain't seed none.
Well, we'll get you some rats.
Why, Marse Tom, I don't want no rats. Dey's the damn blamedest creatures to sturb a body and rustle over round 'em, and bite his feet when he's tryin' to sleep I ever see. No, sah, gimme gyarda snakes, if I's got to have 'em, but don't gimme no rats. I hain't got no use for 'em, scarcely.
But Jim, you got to have 'em. They all do. So don't make no more fuss about it. Prisoners ain't ever without rats. There ain't no instance of it. And they train them and pet them and learn them tricks, and they get to be as sociable as flies. But you gotta play music to them. You got anything to play music on?
I ain't got nothing but a coarse comb and a piece of paper and a juice harp, but I reckon they wouldn't take no stock in a juice harp.
Yes, they would. They don't care what kind of music 'tis. A juice harp's plenty good enough for a rat. All animals like music. In a prison they dote on it, especially painful music, and you can't get no other kind out of a Jew's harp. It always interests them. They come out to see what's the matter with you. Yes, you're all right. You're fixed very well. You want to set on your bed nights before you go to sleep, and early in the mornings, and play your Jew's harp. Play The Last Link is Broken. That's the thing that'll scoop up a rat quicker than anything else. And when you played about 2 minutes, you'll see all the rats and the snakes and spiders and things begin to feel worried about you and come, and they'll just fairly swarm over to you and have a noble good time.
Yes, they will, I reckon, Marse Tom, but what kind of time is Jim having? Blessed if I can see the pint, but I'll do it if I got to. I reckon I better keep the animals satisfied and not have no trouble in the house.
Tom waited to think it over and see if there wasn't nothing else, and pretty soon he says,
Oh, there's one thing I forgot. Could you raise a flower here, do you reckon?
I don't know, but maybe I could, Marse Tom, but it's a tolerable dark in here, and I ain't got no use for no flower, nohow, and she'd be a powerful sight of trouble.
Well, you try it anyway. Some other prisoners has done it.
One of them big cattail-looking mullen stalks would grow in here, Marse Tom, I reckon, but she wouldn't be worth half the trouble she'd cost.
Don't you believe it? We'll fetch you a little one, and you plant it in the corner over there, and raise it. And don't call it mullen, call it pachoila. That's the right name when it's in a prison. And you want to water it with your tears.
Why, I got plenty of spring water, Marse Tom.
You don't want spring water. You want to water it with your tears. It's the way they always do.
Why, Marse Tom, I lay I can raise one of them mullen stalks twice with spring water whilst another man's a-starting one with tears.
That ain't the idea. You got to do it with tears.
She'll die on my hands, Marse Tom. She surely will. Case I don't scarcely ever cry.
So Tom was stumped, but he studied it over, and then said Jim would have to worry along the best he could with an onion. He promised he would go to the nigger cabins and drop one private in Jim's coffee pot in the morning. Jim said he would just as soon have tobacco in his coffee, and found so much fault with it, and with the work and bother of raising the mullein, and Jews harping the rats, and petting and fettering up the snakes and spiders and things, on top of all the other work he had to do on pans, and inscriptions, and journals and things, which made it more trouble and worry and responsibility to be a prisoner than anything he ever undertook, that Tom most lost all patience with him, and said he was just loaded and down with more gaudier chances than a prisoner ever had in the world to make a name for himself, and yet he didn't know enough to appreciate them, and they was just about wasted on him. So Jim he was sorry, and said he wouldn't behave so no more, and then me and Tom shoved for bed. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39. Rats, Lively Bedfellows, The Straw Dummy. In the morning we went up to the village, and bought a wire rat trap and fetched it down, and unstopped the best rat hole, and in about an hour we had 15 of the bulliest kind of ones, and then we took it and put it in a safe place under Aunt Sally's bed. But while we was gone for spiders, little Thomas Franklin Benjamin Jefferson Alexander Phillips found it there, and opened the door of it to see if the rats would come out, and they did. And Aunt Sally, she would come in, and when we got back she was a-standing on top of the bed raising Cain, and the rats was doing what they could to keep off the dull times for her. So she took and dusted us both with the hickory, and we was as much as 2 hours, catching another 15 or 16, drat that middlesome cub. And they weren't the likeliest, nuther, because the first haul was the pick of the flock. I never see a likelier lot of rats than what that first haul was. We got a splendid stock of sorted spiders and bugs and frogs and caterpillars and one thing or another, and we like to got a hornet's nest, but we didn't. The family was at home. We didn't give it right up, but stayed with them as long as we could, because we allowed we'd tire them out or they'd got to tire us out, and they done it. Then we got alicampane and rubbed on the places, and was pretty near all right again, but couldn't set down convenient. And so we went for the snakes, and grabbed a couple of dozen gardeners and house snakes, and put them in a bag, and put it in our room, and by that time it was supper time, and a rattling good honest day's work. And hungry? Oh no, I reckon not. And there wasn't a blessed snake up there when we went back. We didn't half tie the sack, and they worked out somehow and left. But it didn't matter much, because they was still on the premises somewheres. So we judged we could get some of them again. No, there weren't no real scarcity of snakes about the house for a considerable spell. You'd see them dripping from the rafters in places every now and then, and they generally landed in your plate or down the back of your neck, and most of the time where you didn't want them. Well, they was handsome and striped, and there weren't no harm in a million of 'em, but that never made no difference to Aunt Sally. She despised snakes, be the breed what they might, and she couldn't stand them no way you could fix it. And every time one of them flopped down on her, it didn't make no difference what she was doing. She would just lay that work down and light out. I never see such a woman, and you could hear her whoop to Jericho. You couldn't get her to take a hold of one of them with the tongs. And if she turned over and found one in bed, whoo, she would scrabble out and lift a howl that you would think the house was afire. She disturbed the old man so that he said he could most wish there hadn't ever been no snakes created. Why, after every last snake had been gone clear out of the house for as much as a week, Aunt Sally weren't over it yet. She weren't near over it. When she was settin' thinking about something, you could touch her on the back of her neck with a feather, and she would jump right out of her stockings. It was very curious, but Tom said all women was just so. He said they was made that way for some reason or 'nother. We got a lickin' every time one of our snakes comes in her way, and she allowed these lickin's were nothin' to what she would do if we ever loaded up the place again with them. I didn't mind the lickin's, because they didn't amount to nothin', but I minded the trouble we had to lay in another lot. But we got them laid in, and all the other things, and you never see a cabin as blithesome as Jim's was, when they swarmed all out for music and go for 'em. Jim didn't like spiders, and spiders didn't like Jim, and so they laid for 'em, and make it mighty warm for 'em, and he said that between the rats and the snakes and the grindstone there weren't no room in bed for 'em. And when there was, a body couldn't sleep. It was so lively, and it was always lively, he said, because they never all slept at one time, but took turn about, so when the snakes was asleep, the rats was on deck, and when the rats turned in, the snakes come out watch. So we always had one gang under 'em, in his way, and t'other gang having a circus over 'em. And if he got up to hunt a new place, the spiders would take a chance at him as he crossed over. He said if he ever got out this time he wouldn't never be a prisoner again, not for a salary. Well, by the end of the 3 weeks everything was in pretty good shape. The shirt was set in early in a pie, and every time a rat bit Jim, he would get up and write a little in his journal whilst the ink was fresh. The pens was made. The inscriptions and so on was all carved on the grindstone. The bed leg was sawed in two, and we had et up the sawdust, and it give us a most amazing stomach ache. We reckoned we was all going to die, but didn't. It was the most undigestible sawdust I ever see, and Tom said the same. But as I was saying, we got all the work done now, at last, and we was all pretty much fagged out too, but mainly Jim. The old man had wrote a couple of times on the plantation below Orleans to come and get their runaway nigger, but hadn't got no answer, because there weren't no such plantation. So he allowed he would advertise Jim in the St. Louis and the New Orleans papers, and when he mentioned the St. Louis ones, it give me the cold shivers, and I see we hadn't no time to lose. So Tom said, now for the anonymous letters. What's them? I says.
Warnings to the people that something is up. Sometimes it's done one way, sometimes another. But there's always somebody spying around that gives notice to the governor of the castle. When Louis XVI was going to light out one of the Tuileries, a servant girl done it. It's a very good way, and so is the anonymous letters. We'll use them both. And it's usual for the prisoner's mother to change clothes with him, and she stays in, and he slides out in her clothes. We'll do that too.
But looky here, Tom. What do we want to warn anybody for that something's up? Let them find out for themselves. It's their lookout.
Yes, I know, but you can't depend on them. It's the way they've acted from the very start. Left us to do everything. They're so confiding and mullet-headed that they don't take notice of nothing at all. So if we don't give them notice, there won't be nobody nor nothing to interfere with us. And so after all our hard work and trouble, this escape will go off perfectly flat. Won't amount to nothing. Won't be nothing to it.
Well, as for me, Tom, that's the way I'd like,
Shucks.
he says, and looked disgusted. So I says, but I ain't going to make no complaint. Anyway, that suits you suits me. What you going to do about the servant girl?
You'll be her. You slide in the middle of the night and hook that yaller girl's frock.
Why, Tom, that'll make trouble next morning, because of course she probably ain't got any but that one.
I know, but you don't want it but 15 minutes to carry the anonymous letter and shove it under the front door.
All right, then, I'll do it, but I could carry it just as handy in my own togs.
You wouldn't look like a servant girl then, would you?
No, but there won't be nobody to see what I look like anyway.
That ain't got nothing to do with it. The thing for us to do is just to do our duty and not worry about whether anybody sees us do it or not. Hain't you got no principle at all?
All right, I ain't saying nothing. I'm the servant girl. Who's Jim's mother?
I'm his mother. I'll hook a gown from Aunt Sally.
Well then, you'll have to stay in the cabin when me and Jim leaves.
Not much. I'll stuff Jim's clothes full of straw and lay it on his bed to represent his mother in disguise, and Jim'll take the nigger woman's gown off of me and wear it, and we'll all evade together. When a prisoner of style escapes, it's called an evasion. It's always called so when a king escapes, for instance, and the same with a king's son. It don't make no difference whether he's a natural one or an unnatural one.
So Tom wrote an anonymous letter, and I smoked the yaller wench's frock that night, and put it on, and shoved it under the front door, the way Tom told me to. It said,
Beware, trouble is brewing. Keep a sharp lookout, unknown friend.
Next night we stuck a picture, when Tom drawed in blood, of a skull and crossbones on the front door, and next night another one of a coffin on the back door. I never see a family in such a sweat. They couldn't have been worse scared, and the place had been full of ghosts laying for them behind everything and under the beds and shivering through the air. If a door banged, Aunt Sally she jumped and said,
Ouch!
if anything fell, she jumped and said,
Ouch!
if you happened to touch her when she weren't noticing, she done the same. She couldn't face no way and be satisfied, because she allowed there was something behind her every time. So she was always a whirling around sudden and saying,
Ouch!
and before she got 2/3 around, she'd whirl back again and say it again, and she was afraid to go to bed, but she doesn't set up. So the thing was working very well, Tom said. He said he never see a thing work more satisfactory. He said it showed it was done right. So he said, now for the grand bulge. So the very next morning, at the streak of dawn, we got another letter ready, and was wondering what we better do with it, because we heard them say at supper they was going to have a nigger on watch at both doors all night. Tom, he went down the lightning rod to spy around, and the nigger at the back door was asleep, and he stuck it in the back of his neck and come back. This letter said,
Don't betray me. I wish to be your friend. There is a desperate gang of cutthroats from over in the Indian Territory going to steal your runaway nigger tonight, and they have been trying to scare you so as you will stay in the house and not bother them. I am one of the gang, but have got religion and wish to quit it and lead an honest life again, and will betray the hellish design. They will sneak down from the northards along the fence at midnight exact with a false key, and go in the nigger's cabin to get him. I am to be off a piece and blow a tin horn if I see any danger, but instead of that I will baa like a sheep as soon as they get in, and not blow at all. Then, Whilst they are getting his chains loose, you slip there and lock them in, and can kill them at your leisure. Don't do anything but just the way I am telling you. If you do, they will suspicion something, and raise whoop jamboree hoo. I do not wish any reward, but to know I have done the right thing. Unknown friend.
End of chapter 39. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 40. Fishing. The Vigilance Committee. A lively run. Jim advises a doctor. We was feelin' pretty good after breakfast, and took my canoe and went out over the river a fishin' with the lunch, and had a good time, and took a look at the raft and found her all right, and got home late to supper, and found them in such a sweat and worry they didn't know which end they was standin' on, and made us go right off to bed the minute we was done supper, and wouldn't tell us what the trouble was, and never let on a word about the new letter, but didn't need to, because we knowed as much about it as anybody did, and as soon as we was half upstairs and her back was turned we slid for the cellar cupboard and loaded up a good lunch and took it up to our room and went to bed, and got up about 11:30, and Tom put on Aunt Sally's dress that he stole and was going to start with the lunch, but says,
Where's the butter?
I laid out a hunk of it, I says, on a piece of a corn pone.
Well, you left it laid out. Then it ain't here.
We can get along without it, I says.
We can get along with it too.
He says,
Just you slide down cellar and fetch it, and then mosey right down the lightning rod and come along. I'll go and stuff the straw into Jim's clothes to represent his mother in disguise, and be ready to baa like a sheep and shove soon as you get there.
So out he went, and down cellar went I. The hunk of butter, big as a person's fist, was where I had left it, so I took up the slab of corn pone with it on, and blowed out my light, and started upstairs very stealthily, and got up to the main floor all right, but here comes Aunt Sally with a candle, and I clapped the trunk in my hat, and clapped my hat on my head, and the next second she see me, and she says,
You've been down cellar?
Yes'm.
What you been doing down there?
Nothing.
Nothing?
No, ma'am.
Well then, what possessed you to go down there this time of night?
I don't know, ma'am.
You don't know? Don't answer me that way. Tom, I want to know what you've been doing down there.
I hain't been doing a single thing, Aunt Sally. I hope to gracious if I have. I reckoned she let me go now, and as a general thing she would, but I suppose there was so many strange things going on, she was just in a sweat about every little thing that weren't yardstick straight, so she says, very decided,
You just march into that sitting room and stay there till I come. You been up to something you no business to, and I lay I'll find out what it is before I'm done with you.
So she went away as I opened the door and walked into the sitting room. My, but there was a crowd there. 15 farmers, and every one of them had a gun. I was most powerful sick, and slunk to a chair and sit down. They was sittin' around, some of them talking a little in a low voice, and all of them fidgety and uneasy, but trying to look like they weren't. But I knowed they was, because they was always taking off their hats, and putting them on, and scratching their heads, and changing their seats, and fumbling with their buttons. I weren't easy myself, but I didn't take my hat off, all the same. I did wish Aunt Sally would come and get done with me, and lick me, if she wanted to, and let me get away and tell Tom how we'd overdone this thing, and what a thunderin' hornet's nest we'd got ourselves into, so we would stop foolin' around straight off, and clear out with Jim before these rips got out of patience and come for us. At last, she come and began to ask me questions, but I couldn't answer them straight. I didn't know which end of me was up, because these men was in such a fidget now that some was wanting to start right now and lay for them desperadoes, and saying it weren't but a few minutes to midnight, and others was trying to get them to hold on and wait for the sheep signal. And here was Auntie pegging away at the questions, and me a shaking all over, and ready to sink down in my tracks, I was that scared, and the place getting hotter and hotter, and the butter beginning to melt and run down my neck and behind my ears, and pretty soon, when one of them says,
I'm for going and getting in the cabin first, and right now, and catching them when they come.
I most dropped, and a streak of butter come a trickling down my forehead, and Aunt Sally, she see it, and turns white as a sheet, and says,
For the land's sake, what is the matter with the child? He's got the brain fever, sure as you're born, and they're oozing out.
And everybody runs to see, and she snatches off my hat, and out comes the bread and what was left of the butter, and she grabbed me and hugged me and says,
Oh, what a turn you did give me, and how glad and grateful I am it ain't no worse. For luck's against us, and it never rains but it pours, and when I see that truck I thought we lost you, for I knowed by the colour, and all it was just like your brains would be if— Dear, why didn't you tell me that was what you'd been doing there for? I wouldn't have cared. Now clear up to bed, and don't let me see no more of you till the morning.
I was upstairs in a second, and down the lightning rod in another one, and shining through the dark for the lean-to. I couldn't hardly get my words out, I was so anxious, but I told Tom as quick as I could we must jump for it now, and not a minute to lose. The house was full of men yonder, with guns. His eyes just blazed, and he says,
No! Is that so? Ain't it bully? Why, Huck, if it was to do over again, I bet I could fetch 200 if we could put it off till—
Hurry, hurry, I says. Where's Jim?
Right at your elbow. If you reach out your arm, you can touch him. He's dressed and everything's ready. Now we'll slide out and give the sheep signal.
But then we heard the tramp of men coming to the door, and heard them begin to fumble with the padlock, and heard a man say,
I told you we'd be too soon. They haven't come. The door is locked. Here, I'll lock some of you into the cabin, and you'll lay for them in the dark and kill 'em when they come, and the rest scatter around a piece and listen if you can hear 'em coming.
So when they come, but couldn't see us in the dark, and most trod on us whilst we was hustling to get under the bed. But we got under all right, and out through the hole, swift but soft, Jim first, me next, and Tom last, which was according to Tom's orders. Now we was in the lean-to, and heard trampings close by outside, so we crept to the door, and Tom stopped us there and put his eye to the crack, but couldn't make out nothing, it was so dark, and whispered and said he would listen for the steps to get further, and when he nudged us, Jim must glide out first and him last. So he set his ear to the crack and listened, and listened, and listened, and steps a-scraping around out there all the time, and at last he nudged us, and we slid out, and scooped down, not breathing, and not making a least noise, and slipped stealthily towards the fence in Injun file, and got to it all right, and me and Jim over it, but Tom's britches catched fast on a splinter on the top rail, and then he heard the steps coming, so we had to pull loose, which snapped the splinter and made a noise. And as he dropped in our tracks and started, somebody sings out,
Who's that? Answer, or I'll shoot.
But we didn't answer. We just unfurled our heels and shoved. Then there was a rush, and a bang, 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 and the bullets fairly whizzed around us. We heard them sing out,
Here they are.
They've broke for the river.
After 'em, boys, and turn loose the dogs.
So here they come, full tilt. We could hear 'em because they wore boots and yelled, but we didn't wear no boots and didn't yell. We was in the path to the mill, and when they got pretty close to us, we dodged into the bush and let them go by, and then dropped in behind them. They'd had all the dogs shut up, so they weren't scare off the robbers. But by this time somebody had let them loose, and here they come, making pow-wow enough for a million. But they were our dogs, so we stopped in our tracks till they catched up, and when they see it weren't nobody but us, and no excitement to offer them, they only just said howdy, and tore right ahead towards the shouting and clattering. And then we up steamed again, and whizzed along after them till we was nearly to the mill, and then struck up through the bush to where my canoe was tied, and hopped in, and pulled for dear life towards the middle of the river, but didn't make no more noise than we was obleeged to. Then we struck out, easy and comfortable, for the island where my raft was, and we could hear them yelling and barking at each other all up and down the bank, till we was so far away the sounds got dim and died out, and when we stepped on to the raft I says, "Now, old Jim, you're a free man again, and I bet you won't ever be a slave no more."
And a mighty good job it was, too, Huck. It is planned beautiful, and it is done beautiful, and they ain't nobody can get up a plan that's more mixed up and splendid than what that one was.
We was all glad as we could be, but Tom was the gladdest of all because he had a bullet in the calf of his leg. When me and Jim heard that, we didn't feel so brash as what we did before. It was hurtin' him considerable and bleedin', so we laid him in the wigwam and tore up one of the Duke's shirts for to bandage him, but he says,
Gimme the rags, I can do it myself. Don't stop now, don't fool around here, and the evasion boomin' along so handsome. Man the sweeps and set her loose. Boys, we done it elegant, 'deed we did. I wish we'd a had the handlin' of Louis the 14th. There wouldn't have been no son of St. Louis ascend to heaven, wrote down in his biography. No, sir. We'd a whooped him over the border. That's what we'd a done with him, and done it just as slick as nothing at all, too. Man the sweeps, man the sweeps.
but me and Jim was consultin' and thinkin', and after we'd thought a minute, I says, "Say it, Jim." So he says,
Well, then, this is the way it looked to me, Huck. If it was him that is being sot free, and one of the boys was to get shot, would he say, "Go on and save me, never mind about a doctor for to save this one"? Is that like Marsh Tom Sawyer? Would he say that? You bet he wouldn't. Well, then, is Jim going to say it? No, sir. I don't budge a step out in this place without a doctor, not if it's 40 year.
I knowed he was white inside, and I reckoned he'd say what he did say. So it was all right now, and I told Tom I was a-goin' for a doctor. He raised considerable now about it, but me and Jim stuck to it and wouldn't budge, so he was for crawlin' out and settin' the raft loose himself, but we wouldn't let him. Then he give us a piece of his mind, but it didn't do no good. So when he sees me gettin' the canoe ready, he says,
Well, then, if you're bound to go, I'll tell you the way to do when you get to the village. Shut the door, and blindfold the doctor tight and fast, and make him swear to be silent as the grave, and put a purse full of gold in his hand, and then take and lead him all around the back alleys and everywheres in the dark, and then fetch him here in the canoe, in a roundabout way, amongst the islands, and search him, and take his chalk away from him, and don't give it back to him till you get him back to the village, or else he will chalk this raft so he can find it again. It's the way they all do.
So I said I would, and left. And Jim was to hide in the woods when he sees the doctor comin' till he was gone again. End of Chapter 40. Chapter 41. The Doctor, Uncle Silas, Sister Hotchkiss, Aunt Sally in Trouble. The doctor was an old man, a very nice, kind-looking old man, when I got him up. I told him me and my brother was over on Spanish Island, hunting yesterday afternoon, and camped on a piece of a raft we found, and about midnight he must ha' kicked his gun in his dreams, for it went off and shot him in the leg, and we wanted him to go over there and fix it, and not say nothing about it, nor let anybody know, because we wanted to come home this evening and surprise the folks.
Who is your folks?
He says. The Phelpses down yonder.
Oh.
He says. And after a minute he says,
How'd you say he got shot?
He had a dream, I says, and it shot him.
Singular dream,
he says. So he lit up his lantern and got his saddlebags, and we started. But when he sees the canoe, he didn't like the look of her. Said she was big enough for one, but didn't look pretty safe for two. I says, Oh, you needn't be afraid, sir. She carried the three of us easy enough.
What three?
Why, me and Sid and the guns. That's what I mean.
Oh.
He says. But he put his foot on the gunwale and rocked her and shook his head and said he reckoned he'd look around for a bigger one. But they was all locked and chained. So he took my canoe and said for me to wait till he come back, or I could hunt around further, or maybe I better go down home and get them ready for the surprise if I wanted to. But I said I didn't. So I told him just how to find the raft, and then he started. I struck an idea pretty soon. I says to myself, supposin' he can't fix that leg just in 3 shakes of a sheep's tail, as the saying is. Supposin' it takes him 3 or 4 days. What are we goin' to do? Lay around here till he lets the cat out of the bag? No, sir. I knows what I'll do. I'll wait. And when he comes back, if he says he's got to go any more, I'll get down there too, if I swim, and we'll take and tie him, and keep him, and shove out down the river, and when Tom's done with him, we'll give him what it's worth, or all we got, and then let him get ashore. So then I crept into a lumber pile to get some sleep, and next time I waked up, the sun was away up over my head. I shot out and went for the doctor's house, but they told me he'd gone away in the night some time or other, and weren't back yet. Well, thinks I, that looks powerful bad for Tom, and I'll dig out for the island right off. So away I shoved, and turned the corner, and nearly rammed my head into Uncle Silas's stomach. He says,
Why, Tom, where you been all this time, you rascal?
I hain't been nowheres, I says. Only just hunting for the runaway nigger, me and Sid.
Why, wherever did you go?
He says.
Your aunt's been mighty uneasy.
She needn't, I says, because we was all right. We followed the man and the dogs, but they outrun us, and we lost 'em. But we thought we heard them on the water, so we got a canoe and took out after them and crossed over, but couldn't find nothing of 'em, so we cruised along up shore till we got kinda tired and beat out, and tied up the canoe and went to sleep, and never waked till about an hour ago. Then we paddled over here to hear the news, and Sid's at the post office to see what he can hear, and I'm a branching out to get something to eat for us, and then we're going home. So then we went to the post office to get Sid, but just as I suspicioned, he weren't there. So the old man he got a letter out of the office, and we waited a while longer, but Sid didn't come. So the old man said, Come along, let Sid foot it home. or canoe it when he got done fooling around, but we would ride. I couldn't get him to let me stay and wait for Sid, and he said there weren't no use in it, and I must come along and let Aunt Sally see we was all right. When we got home, Aunt Sally was that glad to see me she laughed and cried both, and hugged me, and gave me one of them lickin's of hern that don't amount to shucks, and said she'd serve Sid the same when he come. And the place was plumb full of farmers and farmers' wives to dinner, and such another clack a body never heard. Old Mrs. Hotchkiss was the worst. Her tongue was a-goin' all the time. She says,
"Well, Sister Phipps, I've ransacked that 'ere cabin over, and I believe the nigger was crazy. I says to Sister Damrell, didn't I, Sister Damrell? Si, he's crazy, si. Them's the very words I said. Y'all hearin' me? He's crazy, si. Everything shows it, si. Look at that 'ere grindstone, si. Won't tell me any creatures in his right minds are gonna scrabble all them crazy things onto a grindstone, si. He is sich and sich a person busted his heart, and he is so and so pegged along for 37 year and all that, natural son of Lewis somebody, and sich everlasting rubbish. He's plumb crazy, si. It's what I says in the first place, it's what I says in the middle, and it's what I says last and all the time. The nigger's crazy. Crazy as Nebuchadnezzar, si.
And look at that air ladder made out'n rags, Sister Hotchkiss,
says old Mrs. Damrell.
What in the name of goodness could he ever want of—
The very words I was a-saying no longer ago than this minute to Sister Utterback, and she'll tell you so herself. Says she, look at that ere rag ladder, says she, and says I, yes, look at it, says I, what could he a wanted of it, says I. Says she, Sister Hotchkiss, says she—
But how in the nation they'd ever get that grindstone in there anyway? And who dug that air hole? And who—
My very words, Brother Penrod. I was a-saying, pass that ere sass of molasses, won't you? I was a-saying to Sister Dunlap just this minute, how did they get that grindstone in there, si? Without help, mind you. Without help. That's where it is. Don't tell me, si. There was help, si. And there was a plenty help, too, si. There's been a dozen of helping that nigger, and I lay I'd skin every last nigger on this place, but I'd find out who done it, si. And moreover, si.
A dozen, says you? 40 couldn't have done everything that's been done. Look at them case-knife saws and things, how tedious they've been made. Look at that bed leg sawed off with 'em, a week's work for 6 men. Look at that nigger made out'n straw on the bed, and look at—
You may well say it, Brer Hightower. It's just as I was saying to Brer Phelps, his own self. Says he, what do you think of it, Sister Hotchkiss, says he. Think of what, Brer Phelps, says I. Think of that bed leg sawed off that way. Think of it, says I. I lay it never sawed itself off, says I. Somebody sawed it, says I. That's my opinion, take it or leave it. It mayn't be no count, says I, but sich as 'tis, it's my opinion, says I. And if anybody can start a better one, says I, let him do it, says I, that's all. I says so to Sister Dunlap, says I.
Why, dog my cats, they must have been a house full of niggers in there every night for 4 weeks to have done all that work, Sister Phelps. Look at that shirt, every last inch of it, kivered over with secret African writing, done with blood. Must have been a raft of 'em at it right along, all the time a'most. Why, I'd give $2 to have it read to me, and as for the niggers that wrote it, I 'low I'd take 'em and lash 'em till—
People to help him, Brother Marples? Well, I reckon you'd think so if he'd been in this house for a while back. Why, they've stole everything they could lay their hands on, and we are watching all the time, mind you. They stole that shirt right off of the line. And as for that sheet they made the rag ladder out of, there ain't no telling how many times they didn't steal that. And flour, and candles, and candlesticks, and spoons, and the old warming pan, and most 1,000 things that I disremember now, and my new calico dress, and me, and Silas, and my Sid and Tom on the constant watch day and night, as I was a-telling you, and not a one of us could catch hide nor hair nor sight, nor sound of 'em. And here at the last minute, lo and behold you, they slides right on under our noses and fools us, and not only fools us, but the Injun Territory robbers too, and actually gets away with that nigger safe and sound, and that with 16 men and 22 dogs right on their very heels at that very time. I tell you, it just bangs anything I ever heard of. Why, spirits couldn't have done better and been no smarter. And I reckon they must have been spirits, because you know our dogs, and there ain't no better. Well, them dogs never even got on the track of 'em once. You explain that to me if you can. Any of you.
Well, it does beat
Lows alive, I never.
So help me, I want to be...
house thieves as well as...
Goodness gracious sakes, I'd have been afeard to live in such a...
Afraid to live? Why, I was that scared I doesn't hardly go to bed, or get up, or lay down, or set down, Sister Ridgway. Why, they'd steal the very... Why, goodness sakes, you can guess what kind of fuss I was in by the time midnight come last night. I hope to gracious if I wasn't afraid they'd steal some of the family. I was just to that pass I didn't have no reasoning faculties no more. It looks foolish enough now, in the daytime, but I says to myself, there's my 2 poor boys asleep, way upstairs in their lonesome room, and I declare to goodness I was that uneasy that I crept up all there and locked 'em in. I did. And anybody would, because you know, when you get scared that way, and it keeps running on, and getting worse and getting all the time, and you it gets to addling, and you get to doing all sorts of wild things, and by you think to yourself, suppose it was a boy, and was away up there, and the door ain't locked, and you...
She stopped, looking kind of wondering, and then she turned her head around slow, and when her eye lit on me, I got up and took a walk. Says I to myself, I can't explain better how we come to not be in that room this morning if I go out to one side and study over it a little. So I done it, but I doesn't go fur, or she'd a sent for me. And when I was late in the day, the people all went, and then I come in and told her the noise and shooting waked me up, and the door was locked, and we wanted to see the fun, so we went down the lightning rod, and both of us got hurt a little, and we didn't never want to try that no more. And then I went on and told her all what I told Uncle Silas before, and then she said she'd forgive us, and maybe it was all right enough anyway, and about what a body might expect of boys, for all boys was a pretty harum-scarum lot as fur as she could see, and so, as long as no harm hadn't come of it, she judged she'd better put in her time being grateful we was alive and well, and she had us still, 'stead of fretting over what was past and done. So then she kissed me, and patted me on the head, and dropped into a kind of a brown study, and pretty soon jumps up and says,
Why, laws a mercy, it's most night and Sid not come yet. What has become of that boy?
I see my chance, so I skips up and says, I'll run right up to town and get him, I says.
No, you won't,
she says.
You'll stay right where you are, once enough to be lost at time. If you ain't here to supper, your uncle'll go.
Well, he weren't there to supper, so right after supper Uncle went. He come back about 10 a little bit uneasy, hadn't run across Tom's track. Aunt Sally was a good deal uneasy, but Uncle Silas, he said there weren't no occasion to be. Boys will be boys, he said, and you'll see this one turn up in the morning, all sound and right. So she had to be satisfied. But she said she'd set up for him a while anyway, and keep a light burning, so he could see it. And then, when I went up to bed, she come up with me and fetched her candle, and tucked me in, and mothered me so good I felt mean, and like I couldn't look her in the face. And she sat down on the bed and talked with me a long time, and said what a splendid boy Sid was, and didn't seem to want to ever stop talking about him, and kept asking me every now and then if I reckoned he could got a lost, or hurt, or maybe drownded, and might be laying at this minute somewhere suffering or dead, and she not by him to help him. And so the tears would drip down silent, and I would tell her that Sid was all right, and would be home in the morning, sure. And she would squeeze my hand, or maybe kiss me, and tell me to say it again, and keep on saying it, because it done her good, and she was in so much trouble. And when she was a-going away, she looked down in my eyes so steady and gentle and says,
The door ain't going to be locked, Tom, and there's the window and the rod, but you'll be good, won't you? And you won't go, for my sake?
Laws knows I wanted to go bad enough to see about Tom, and was all intending to go, but after that I wouldn't a went, not for kingdoms. But she was on my mind, and Tom was on my mind, so I slept very restless, and twice I went down the rod, away in the night, and slipped around front, and see her sitting there by her candle in the window, with her eyes towards the road, and the tears in them, and I wished I could do something for her, but I couldn't, only to swear that I wouldn't never do nothing to grieve her any more. And the third time I waked up at dawn, and slid down, and she was there yet, and her candle was almost out, and her old gray head was resting on her hand, and she was asleep. End of chapter 41. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 42. Tom Sawyer Wounded. The Doctor's Story. Tom confesses. Aunt Polly arrives. Hand out them letters. The old man was up town again before breakfast, but couldn't get no track of Tom, and both of them set at the table thinking, and not saying nothing, and looking mournful, and their coffee getting cold, and not eating anything, and by the old man says,
Did I give you the letter?
What letter?
The one I got yesterday, out of the post office.
No, you didn't give me no letter.
Well, I must have forgot.
So he rummaged his pockets, and then went off somewheres where he had laid it down, and fetched it, and give it to her. She says,
Why, it's from St. Petersburg's. It's from Sis.
I allowed another walk would do me good, but I couldn't stir. But before she could break it open, she dropped it and run, for she see something. And so did I. It was Tom Sawyer on a mattress, and that old doctor, and Jim in her calico dress, with his hands tied behind him, and a lot of people. I hid the letter behind the first thing that come handy, and rushed. She flung herself at Tom, crying, and says,
Oh, it's dead! He's dead! I know he's dead!
And Tom, he turned his head a little, and muttered something or other, which showed he weren't in his right mind. Then she flung up her hands and says,
He's alive, thank God, and that's enough.
And she snatched a kiss from him, and flew for the house to get the bed ready, and scattering orders right and left at the niggers and everybody else, as fast as her tongue could go, every jump of the way. I followed the men to see what they was going to do with Jim, and the old doctor and Uncle Silas followed after Tom into the house. The men was very huffy, and some of them wanted to hang Jim for an example to all the other niggers around there, so they wouldn't be trying to run away like Jim done, and make such a raft of trouble, and keeping a whole family scared most to death for days and nights. But the others said, Don't do it. It wouldn't answer at all. He ain't our nigger, and his owner would turn up and make us pay for him sure. So that cooled them down a little, because the people that's always the most anxious for to hang a nigger that hain't done just right is always the very ones that ain't the most anxious to pay for him when they've got their satisfaction out of him. They cussed Jim considerable, though, and give him a cuff or two side of the head once in a while, but Jim never said nothing, and he never let on to know me, and they took him to the same cabin, and put his own clothes on him, and chained him again, and not to no bed leg this time, but to a big staple drove into the bottom log, and chained his hands too, and both legs, and said he weren't to have nothing but bread and water to eat after this till his owner come, or he was sold at auction because he didn't come in a certain length of time, and filled up our hole, and said a couple of farmers with guns most stand watch around about the cabin every night, and a bulldog tied to the door in the daytime, and about this time they was through with the job, and was tappering off with a kind of a general good-bye cussin', and then the old doctor comes and takes a look, and says,
Don't be no rougher on him than you're obleeged to, because he ain't a bad nigger. When I got to where I found the boy, I see I couldn't cut the bullet out without some help, and he warn't in no condition for me to leave to go and get help. And he got a little worse and a little worse, and after a long time he went out of his head and wouldn't let me come anigh him any more, and said if I chalked his raft he'd kill me, and no end of wild foolishness like that. And I see I couldn't do anything at all with him. So I says, I've got to have help somehow. And the minute I says it, out crawls this nigger from somewhere and says he'll help. And he done it too, and done it very well. Of course I judged he must be a runaway nigger, and there I was, and there I had to stick right straight along all the rest of the day and all night. It was a fix, I tell you. I had a couple of patients with the chills, and of course I'd have liked to run up to town and see them, but I dasn't, because the nigger might get away, and then I'd be to blame. And yet never a skiff came close enough for me to hail. So there I had to stick plumb until daylight this morning. And I never see a nigger that was a better nuss or faithfuler, and yet he was risking his freedom to do it, and was all tired out too, and I see plain enough that he'd been worked main hard lately. I liked the nigger for that. I tell you, gentlemen, a nigger like that is worth $1,000, and kind treatment too. I had everything I needed, and the boy was doing as well there as he would have done at home. Better, maybe, because it was so quiet. But there I was, with both of 'em on my hands, and there I had to stick till about dawn this morning. Then some men in a skiff come by, and as good luck would have it, the nigger was setting by the pallet with his head propped on his knees, sound asleep. So I motioned them in quiet, and they slipped up on him and grabbed him and tied him before he knowed what he was about. And we never had no trouble. And the boy being in a kind of flighty sleep too, we muffled the oars and hitched the raft on, and towed her over very nice and quiet, and the nigger never made the least row, nor said a word from the start. He ain't no bad nigger, gentlemen, that's what I think about him.
Somebody says,
Well, it sounds very good, Doctor, I'm obliged to say.
Then the other softened up a little too, and I was mighty thankful to that old doctor for doing Jim that good turn, and I was glad it was according to my judgment of him too, because I thought he had a good heart in him, and was a good man the first time I see him. Then they all agreed that Jim had acted very well, and was deservin' to have some notice took of it, and reward. So every one of them promised, right out and hearty, that they wouldn't cuss him no more. Then they come out and locked him up. I hoped they was going to say he could have one or two of the chains took off, because they was rotten heavy, or could have meat and greens with his bread and water, but they didn't think of it, and I reckoned it weren't best for me to mix in, but I judged I'd get the doctor's yarn to Aunt Sally somehow or other, as soon as I got through the breakers that was laying just ahead of me. Explanations, I mean, of how I forgot to mention about Sid being shot, when I was telling how him and me put in that dratted night, paddling around hunting the runaway nigger, but I had plenty time. Aunt Sally, She stuck to the sick room all day and all night, and every time I see Uncle Silas mooning around I dodged him. Next morning I heard Tom was a good deal better, and they said Aunt Sally was gone to get a nap. So I slips to the sick room, and if I found him awake I reckoned we could put up a yarn for the family that would wash. But he was sleepin', and sleepin' very peaceful too, and pale, not fire-faced the way he was when he come. So I set down and laid for him to wake, and about half an hour Aunt Sally comes glidin' in, and there I was, up a stump again. She motioned to me to be still, and set down by me, and begun to whisper, and said we could all be joyful now, because all the symptoms was first rate, and he'd been sleepin' like that for ever so long, and lookin' better and peacefuller all the time, and 10 to 1 he'd wake up in his right mind. So we set there watchin', and by'n by he stirs a bit, and opened his eyes very natural, and takes a look, and says,
Hello? Why, I'm at home. How's that? Where's the raft?
It's all right, I says.
And Jim?
The same, I says, but couldn't say it pretty brash. But he never noticed, but says,
Good. Splendid. Now we're all right and safe. Did you tell Auntie?
I was going to say yes, but she chipped in and says,
About what, Sid?
Why, about the way the whole thing was done.
What whole thing?
Why, the whole thing. There ain't but one. How we set the runaway nigger free, me and Tom.
Good land! Set the run? What is the child talking about? Dear, out of his head again.
No, I ain't out of my head. I know all what I'm talking about. We did set him free, me and Tom. We laid out to do it, and we done it. And we done it elegant, too.
He'd got a start, and she never checked him up. Just set and stared, and let him clip along, and I see it weren't no use for me to put in.
Why, Auntie, it cost us a power of work, weeks of it, hours and hours every night, whilst you was all asleep, and we had to steal candles, and the sheet, and the shirt, and your dress, and spoons, and tin plates, and case knives, and the warming pan, and the grindstone, and flour, and just no end of things, and you can't think what work it was to make the saws, and pans, and inscriptions, and one thing or another, and you can't think half the fun it was. And we had to make up the pictures of coffins and things and anonymous letters from the robbers, and get up and down the lightning rod, and dig the hole into the cabin, and made the rope ladder, and send it in cooked up in a pie, and send in spoons and things to work with in your apron pocket.
Mercy sakes!
And load up the cabin with rats and snakes and so on for company for Jim, and then you kept Tom here so long with the butter in his hat that you come near spilling the whole business, because the man come before we was out of the cabin, and we had to rush, and they heard us and let drive at us, and I got my share, and we dodged out of the path and let them go by, and when the dogs come they weren't interested in us, but went for the most noise. And we got our canoe, and made for the raft, and was all safe, and Jim was a free man, and we done it all by ourselves, and wasn't it bully, Auntie?
Well, I never heard the likes of it in all my born days. So it was you little rapscallions, that's been making all this trouble, and turned everybody's wits clean inside out, and scared us almost to death. I've as good a notion as ever I've had in my life to take it out with you this very minute. To think, here I've been, night after night. You just get well once, you young scamp, and I'll lay I'll tan the old Harry out of both of ye.
But Tom, he was so proud and joyful, he just couldn't hold in, and his tongue just went it. She a chipping in, and spitting fire all along, and both of them going it at once, like a cat convention, and she says,
Well, you get all the enjoyment you can out of it now, For mind I tell you, I catch you meddling with him again.
Meddling with who?
Tom says, dropping his smile and looking surprised.
With who? Why, the runaway nigger, of course. Who do you reckon?
Tom looks at me very grave and says,
Tom, didn't you just tell me he was all right? Hasn't he got away?
Him?
Says Aunt Sally.
The runaway nigger? 'Deed he hasn't. They've got him back, safe and sound, and he's in that cabin again, on bread and water, and loaded down with chains till he's claimed or sold.
Tom rose, square up in bed, with his eye hot, and his nostrils opening and shutting like gills, and sings out to me,
They hain't no right to shut him up. Shove. And don't you lose a minute. Turn him loose. He ain't no slave. He's as free as any critter that walks this earth.
What does the child mean?
I mean every word I say, Aunt Sally, and if somebody don't go, I'll go. I've known him all his life, and so has Tom there. Old Miss Watson died 2 months ago, and she was ashamed she was ever going to sell him down the river, and said so, and she set him free in her will.
Then what on earth did you want to set him free for, seeing he was already free?
Well, that is a question, I must say, and just like women, why, I wanted the adventure of it, and I'd a waded neck deep in blood too. Goodness alive, Aunt Polly!
if she weren't standing right there, just inside the door, looking as sweet and contented as an angel half full of pie, I wish I may never. Aunt Sally jumped for her, and most hugged the head off of her, and cried over and over, and I found a good enough place for me under the bed, for it was getting pretty sultry for us, seemed to me, and I peeped out, and in a little while Tom's Aunt Polly shook herself loose, and stood there looking across at Tom over her spectacles, kind of grinding him into the earth, you know, and then she says,
Yes, you better turn your head away. I would if I was you, Tom.
Oh, dearie me,
says Aunt Sally.
is he changed so? Why, that ain't Tom, it's Sid. Tom's... Why, where is Tom? He was there a minute ago.
You mean where's Huck Finn, that's what you mean. I reckon I ain't raised such a scamp as my Tom all these years not to know him when I see him. That would be pretty howdy-do. Come out from under that bed, Huck Finn.
So I done it, but not feeling brash. Aunt Sally, she was one of the mixed upset-lookingest persons I ever see, except one, and that was Uncle Silas, when he come in, and they told it all to him. It kind of made me drunk, as you may say, and he didn't know nothing at all the rest of the day, and preached a prayer-meeting sermon that night that gave him a rattling reputation, because the oldest man in the world couldn't understood it. So Tom's Aunt Polly, she told all about who I was, and what, and I had to put up, and tell how I was in such a tight place, that when Mrs. Phelps took me for Tom Sawyer, she chipped in and says,
Oh, go on and call me Aunt Sally. I'm used to it now, and take no need to change.
that when Aunt Sally took me for Tom Sawyer, I had to stand it. There weren't no other way, and I knowed he wouldn't mind, because it would be nuts for him, being a mystery, and he'd make an adventure out of it, and be perfectly satisfied. And so it turned out, and he led on to be Sid, and made things as soft as he could for me. And his Aunt Polly, she said Tom was right about old Miss Watson setting Jim free in her will, and so sure enough, Tom Sawyer had gone and took all that trouble and bother to set a free nigger free, and I couldn't ever understand before, until that minute and that talk, how he could help a body set a nigger free with his bringing up. Well, Aunt Polly, she said that when Aunt Sally wrote to her that Tom and Sid had come all right and safe, she says to herself,
Look at that now. I might have expected it, letting him go off that way without anybody to watch him. So now I gotta go and traipse all the way down the river, 1,100 mile, and find out what that creature's up to this time, as long as I couldn't seem to get any answer out of you about it.
Why, I never heard nothing from you,
says Aunt Sally.
Well, I wonder. Why, I wrote you twice to ask what you could mean by Sid being here.
Well, I never got him, sis.
Aunt Polly, she turns around slow and severe and says,
You, Tom.
Well, what?
He says, kind of pettish.
Don't you what me, you impudent thing. Hand out them letters.
What letters?
Them letters. I be bound if I have to take a hold of you, I'll...
They're in the trunk. There now. And they're just the same as they was when I got them out of the office. I ain't looked into them. I ain't touched them. But I knowed they'd make trouble. And I thought if you weren't in no hurry, I'd...
Well, you do need skin, and there ain't no mistake about it. And I wrote another one to tell you I was coming, and I suppose he...
No, it come yesterday. I ain't read it yet, but it's all right. I've got that one.
I wanted to offer to bet $2 she hadn't, but I reckoned maybe it was just as safe to not to, so I never said nothing. End of chapter 42.